Hi there, my name is Huw Jones and I've been debating with the English Speaker Union now for about 3 years, and I've competed in a lot of competitions with them, for instance the ESU Mace and the World Schools Debating Championships. And here today I'm going to answer a few questions to help people who are just starting out with debating. So first of all then, how do I approach emotion when I see a topic that is given to us in a competition and I have, maybe 15 minutes to an hour to think of arguments to why that might be a good or bad thing? What do I do to try and help me? And I think there's a few things that can help out anyone to make sure that they have ideas that they can run in forms of arguments within the debates to help them out. I think the first tip then is to underline any key words within the motions to try and understand exactly what a motion is trying to get the teams to engage with in a round. So for instance, if a motion would look like this house believes that zoos should be banned, that's very different from this house believes that zoos should be banned in the United Kingdom. The words in the United Kingdom would completely change what the meaning of that debate would mean, and it would completely change what the teams are expected to do within that round. So the first thing that you should always do when you see a motion is try to think, why are certain words here in that topic or not here, and what does that mean? And I think after you've thought about that and underlined those keywords, you'll have a much better understanding about what that motion means you should do in terms of your prep time and your debate. So after you've got that sorted then, I think the second big tip that I think is really important is to think about why that motion might have been set. Because I think the people who set motions set them for a reason. It's probably because of a big controversial issue that's happening in society at the moment. So for instance, in a motion that might be this house would ban junk food, that could well be to do with the big problem of obesity in lots of Western countries at the moment. So thinking about those big problems that are associated with motions and why might they be to do with a motion is a really good way to try and think of certain arguments that you can run within a debate. So I think that's another thing that you can do within your preparation time. I think the third thing though is to think about what sort of groups this motion might affect, because every motion will have a bit of a different impact on different groups of people based on where they are and based on their experiences. So thinking about those sorts of things can make your impacts a lot stronger within debates. So for instance, in a motion like this house would ban social media, identifying young people as a vulnerable group within social media and its influence, because maybe it causes depression and anxiety among teenagers, is a really good way of starting to think about arguments within that motion. So always try and think very specifically about which subsets of groups of individuals might be most impacted by emotion and how that can cause your arguments to change a bit within the debate. I think the fourth thing that you can look out for is whether there is a moral or principled justification for doing or not doing a certain thing within a debate. So for instance, the right to free speech, the right to privacy are all things that are important in a lot of debates and are more kind of different from practical outcomes and are also good to think about in terms of debates. I think the last thing you can think about in preparation time when you're approaching a motion is what the other side from you might run. Because if you're on side proposition, thinking about what the opposition might run and preemptively thinking about how you can deal with those sorts of points can be a really damaging way for you to run your own arguments. So that's another thing that you should always think about within preparation time. So finally then, by the end of these tips, you should have a lot of different points within your prep time. And then the thing you should do next is try and group those ideas together. Usually within a case with a team, you should aim to run about 2 to 3 arguments. So grouping these different ideas together can be a really valuable way to run as much content as you can. So there's my tips in terms of how I approach emotion when I'm in a debate and trying to be as effective as I can within preparation time. So the second thing then, how do I structure an argument within a speech? Because I think this is something that's relatively difficult to master, and I certainly aren't perfect at this at all. But I think there's three things that I try and do within arguments to help me out. I think the first one is to note and paint quite a vivid picture what the world looks like now and why that's a good or bad thing. Because being as emotive as you can and using all the tips that I'm sure everyone who's been part of the ESU's training in public speaking will have learned is a really good way to win over judges and persuade them that this might be a good or a bad thing. So if you can paint a picture of why this something might be bad and why this motion might solve it, can be a really valuable way to start off an argument. Then when you're proving why this might not happen or it might happen, there's two key questions that you must always ask. The first is, why is it true? Why is it true that certain things do or don't occur? So for instance, in the motion that we've talked about, this house would ban social media, saying, why is it true that social media might make young people maybe depressed or have anxiety? I think in some cases that's probably because that social media gives people a seemingly perfect life, and know straight away if you're missing out on a certain opportunity. For instance, if your friends have gone out without you, that's something that you find out about straight away from social media. It also really perpetuates this idea of you have to look perfect with things like filters to make you look better. And all those things make young people think less of themselves as people. So then the second really important question is, why is it important? So you say, so I've proven to you why it's true that something happened, but so what? Why is that so important? So for instance, you might say that the fact that young people are now better able to overcome things like mental health is probably good for their lives. It probably means they can concentrate better in school and things like that. So that's really important within an argument too. So overall, within an argument, you should prove what's happening in the world right now and why is that good or bad, then always focusing on why is it true and why is it important. I remember a coach once told me that there's no limit to how much you can ask these questions. You should almost imagine there's a small child in the back of the room asking constantly, but why? That's the amount of scrutiny that you should give to your arguments, and that will mean that you'll always prove the steps that you need to make them effective in a debate. So finally then, how do I approach rebuttal in a rebuttal-heavy speech? Because I think this sounds relatively scary, and I think it's something that debaters struggle with at the start, but I think there's a few things that make it a lot easier. And I think within rebuttal, what effectively you need to do is do exactly the opposite of what you do in building arguments. So instead of saying why it is true and why it is important, in rebuttal you should say why the other side's arguments are not true and not important. And I think a really good way to start here is when you hear an argument that another team runs, just write down on your page, why is that not true? And ideas will start to come flowing to you. And I think that's a very effective way of trying to approaching that. The second thing that you should do though is try and weigh that against your arguments. Because in a lot of cases, you'll be able to say why another team's argument isn't true, but in certain cases, you won't be able to. So in these cases, it's really important to say, even if that argument is true, why is what we've brought you on our side even more important and should win us the debate? That's another place to approach rebuttal. And then finally within this, a few things you can look out for is how much the other team has proved that argument. Have they done enough in terms of why is it true and why is it important, so that argument actually stands? If they haven't, it's worth pointing out that and saying that you can't, as a judge, value this argument very highly because they haven't spent a lot of time on it. That's another thing that can be very effective. But also look out for things like contradictions within arguments, because they can also be really effective in taking those arguments down. So overall, they are my top tips for debaters who are starting out. I really hope that you have a great time debating. Thank you very much.